All right, folks, let's take a look here at section 5. Here's the focus question. In early 1945, Allied triumph seemed inevitable. Hitler briefly pushed the Allies back in France with a surprise counterattack that created a huge bulge in Allied lines. Though the Battle of the Bulge was the largest single battle ever fought by the U.S. Army and inflicted 70,000 American casualties, the German assault failed, and by March, American troops had crossed into Germany. Hitler killed himself, Soviet troops took Berlin, and on May 8th, VE Day, which stood for Victory in Europe, the war against Germany ended. U.S. forces in the Pacific moved closer to Japan after retaking Guam and the Philippines in 1944 and a decisive naval victory at Leyte Gulf. In the 1944 presidential election, Roosevelt defeated Thomas Dewey, Republican governor of New York, and won an unprecedented fourth term. But FDR died on April 12, 1945, before the Allies secured victory. His successor, Harry S. Truman, immediately faced an extraordinary decision: whether to use the atomic bomb against Japan. Truman, not knowing about the bomb before becoming president, was told by the Secretary of War that the United States had built the most terrible weapon ever known in human history. The bomb was a product of Einstein's theory of relativity, which led scientists to use uranium, or man-made plutonium, to create an atomic reaction that could generate enormous power, which could be used for peaceful purposes or to generate a colossal explosion. Fleeing Germany from the United States, Einstein warned Roosevelt that the Nazis were trying to build an atomic weapon and urged Roosevelt to do the same. FDR launched the Manhattan Project, the top secret program in which scientists during the war developed an atomic bomb, which was first tested in New Mexico in July 1945. On August 6, 1945, a U.S. plane dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima, Japan. It virtually destroyed the entire city and killed 70,000 immediately. 140,000 more died from radiation by the end of 1945, and thousands more died in the next 5 years. 3 days later, the United States dropped a second bomb on Nagasaki that killed 70,000. The same day, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. Japan quickly surrendered. The catastrophic number of civilian casualties caused by the bombs have ever since made them controversial. Japanese forces fiercely resisted America's advance in the Pacific, and Truman's advisors warned him that an American invasion of Japan might cost the lives of 250,000 or more American troops. But the U.S. did not plan to invade until 1946, and there were signs that Japan was close to surrender. Japan indicated that it would surrender if Emperor Hirohito retained his throne, but this did not meet Allied demands for unconditional surrender. In the end, the Allies let him stay. Some scientists who developed the atomic bomb asked Truman to use it just to show its power to other nations. Truman never hesitated to employ it. The use of the atomic bomb represented a logical endpoint to the way in which World War II was fought, namely at great cost to civilian life. Compared to World War I, in which 90% of deaths were military personnel, in World War II, 20 million of the 50 million who died were civilians. The Nazi regime had systematically killed its enemies, including millions of Jews, and bombed London and other cities. The Allies, in turn, bombed German cities such as Dresden, where 100,000 civilians perished. In March 1945, nearly the same number died in the U.S. bombing of Tokyo. Although the war and government propaganda led many Americans to dehumanize the Japanese, and few criticized Truman's use of the bomb, public criticism aroused by images of civilian suffering mounted. During the conflict, meetings between Allied leaders outlined the architecture of international relations in the post-war period. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin met in Iran in 1942 and at the Yalta Conference in the Soviet Union in 1945 to develop agreements. The last Big Three conference occurred at Potsdam outside Berlin in July 1945 and involved Stalin, Truman, and Churchill. There, Allied leaders created a military administration for Germany and agreed to try Nazi officials for war crimes. None of the three great Allied powers entirely trusted the others, and each vied for geostrategic advantage. The Allies' decision to delay the invasion of Europe cost many Russian lives on the Eastern Front and incited Soviet resentment. But their sacrifice persuaded Britain and the U.S. to allow the Soviet Union to dominate Eastern Europe. At Yalta, Roosevelt and Churchill barely protested Stalin's plans to control areas of Eastern Europe that had been part of the Russian Empire before World War I. Stalin agreed to enter the war on Japan later in 1945 to include non-communists in the pro-Soviet Polish government and to allow free elections there. but Stalin intended to make Eastern Europe communist, and soon the Allies disagreed over the region's fate. Churchill also resisted U.S. pressure to move toward national independence for India and other British colonies, and he made separate private deals with Stalin to split Southern and Eastern Europe into separate spheres of influence. Britain also fought American efforts to control the post-war global economy. Delegations from 45 nations that met at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in July 1945 replaced the British pound with the US dollar as the main currency for international exchange. During the Depression, FDR had taken the United States off the gold standard, but Bretton Woods again forged a link between the dollar and gold and set other national currencies at a fixed rate in relation to the US dollar. The meeting also created two US-dominated financial institutions. The World Bank would provide money to developing nations and help rebuild Europe, and the International Monetary Fund would prevent governments from devaluing their currencies for trade advantages. Bretton Woods created the structure of the post-war global capitalist economy that made goods and investment more free and recognized the American dominance of world finance. American leaders asserted that free trade would encourage world economic growth, an assumption that continued to govern U.S. foreign policy until the presidency of Donald Trump. In 1944, near Washington, D.C., the Allies also founded a successor organization to the League of Nations. The United Nations would consist of a General Assembly of Nations where each member nation had an equal voice, and a Security Council tasked with maintaining world peace and security. The Security Council had 6 rotating members and 5 permanent ones: Britain, China, France, the Soviet Union, and the United States, each with the power to veto resolutions. In June of 1945, 51 countries, meeting in San Francisco, adopted the UN Charter, which outlawed force or its threat as a means for settling international disputes, and Congress endorsed it the following month. The war radically redistributed world power. The major military powers of Japan and Germany were defeated. Britain and France were weakened. While only America and the Soviet Union could still project their own power on the international stage, the U.S. essentially became the dominant nation in the world. But international harmony did not follow the peace. Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe soon helped spark the Cold War, and the atomic bombs inspired much fear across the globe. Allied rhetoric of freedom was not always followed in post-war policy. In 1941, Winston Churchill and FDR issued the Atlantic Charter, which assured that Nazi Germany's defeat would be followed by free trade, self-government for all nations, and a global New Deal. It specifically embraced freedom from want and freedom from fear, but left out the other 2 of the 4 freedoms in deference to British colonial rule in India, where Britons preferred not to grant freedom of speech and worship. The 4 freedoms in the Atlantic Charter were intended to solidify world opposition to the Axis powers, but it also laid the foundation of human rights and inspired colonized peoples to adopt the language and ideals of freedom and national self-determination and use them in their struggles against the victorious Allied countries, causing more conflict and war in the future. So that's the end of chapter 22, and we'll be back with the next one.